Hello and welcome to the December 20th edition of Ukraine Without Hype. I am Anthony Bardaway. We are in December, the holiday season, so happy Hanukkah to everyone. It is currently Hanukkah, so indulge in some donuts and potato pancakes. And also we have Christmas coming up, which means that even though Kiev continues to go through extremely challenging power outages, it is still the season of Christmas markets, Christmas festivals, and even though the giant Christmas tree displays of pre-war are no longer possible, the Christmas tree is still up in Kiev city center. So if you're listening from inside Ukraine, I urge everyone to get what holiday cheer they can get out of life. Well, it's hard, so every little bit counts. And if you're listening from abroad, keep Ukraine in your thoughts through whichever tradition you may follow. So putting the plugs at the beginning of the episode, which I know is what you're supposed to do, not the end, but here I am going with it, trying to get more good at promotion. But yes, if you'd like to support Ukraine Without Hype or our sister podcast, Radio Free America, you can go to patreon.com/Ukraine Without Hype and join our list of supporters. So thank you all very much for those who do, and welcome anyone who wishes to join. And with that plug out of the way, moving forward into the battlefield updates, and some very key events have happened since our last episode, and I'll begin by going in the opposite direction that we usually do. I usually go north to south. I'll go from south to north this time around. And the first thing to go over is that in our last combat update, I mentioned how the Russians were closing in on the town of Leopolis. And I wish to do more about this city in the future, but for now, just keep in mind that through most of this phase of the war, the threat to it has only come from the south, and now it is coming from both the east and the south, meaning that it very likely will not exist in the near future. It is currently going through heavy bombardment. And though it has been at the front line this whole time, it has been one of the relatively very important, quieter parts of it through much of the fighting. But even then, the city had been heavily destroyed already. Now, I don't see it existing in the near future, unfortunately, which will be the topic of a future segment. But the rapid advance in this area by the Russians has slowed down. The Russians have run into those fortifications, like I said, would happen, and they have lost that momentum that they had for many weeks up until that point. That said, many of the more substantial fortifications are behind rather than in front of Leopolis, so the town is very much in the way, more than a defensive strongpoint in and of itself, which to me is quite tragic. But we also have news that the North Koreans, apparently, anything involving North Korean soldiers is very loosely sourced, we can say, but reports have come out that North Korean soldiers have been involved in this section of the front, though further details of that are like going north of that to the Mirhorod-Krovsk direction. The pocket around this area has gotten tighter. The Russians have made gains, though since our last update, again, on a grand scale, it hasn't been much of a difference. But if you look at any path of exfiltration that Ukraine can take out of Mirhorod, especially, that's all gray zone. There's no clear road out. It's not exactly an encirclement in the sense that proper encirclements are difficult. I was going to say impossible, but the next thing I'm going to talk about shows that it is actually possible. But this gray zone around Mirhorod has gotten a darker shade of gray, though the reports have gotten much more consistent that there have been withdrawals from this area. Though the withdrawals are very dangerous, very deadly, and often have to be aborted when running into Russian resistance, they are happening, as they do very much need to happen. North from there to Kupyansk, and this has been interesting. Very, very interesting. So the last update I was saying about Kupyansk was that the Russians had reached the city center, and that over half of the city had been occupied by Russia, and much of the rest of it gray zone, though Ukraine had somewhat stymied that advance and had begun to push back more. Well, even though the Russians had not fully claimed this city, they said that they did. Russian media, including the Russian presidential office, had put out announcements that they had captured the entirety of Kupyansk and had actually invited journalists to Kupyansk to see the fruits of the Russian army's labor, the grand victory over the city of Kupyansk. And when I was first drafting the script for this episode, I was going to say this slightly differently. I was going to say that the Russians had gotten into a very bizarre habit lately of announcing victories far in advance of when those victories could take place. This likely had mostly to do with the ongoing negotiation process. If they can claim to the Americans that their drive forward was inevitable, making daily gains and city after city was falling to the Russian army, then Donald Trump and the rest of the administration would have to tell themselves, look, this defeat of Ukraine is coming, it's inevitable. The best thing we can do is have it happen now rather than later. So there's very much a strategy to those lies. But now, considering the events I'm about to describe, it seems as though those lies have become truly pathologic, not just strategic, but I don't even know what. Because not only has Russia failed to capture Kupyansk, despite claiming that they have, Ukraine actually launched a localized counteroffensive in the area, where in this massive push, Ukrainian forces, spearheaded by the Khartia Brigade, swept around the city to the north, liberated almost the entirety of Kupyansk, leaving a smaller Russian force trapped in the city center in pockets cut off far from the rest of their force. And in the time since this has happened, they have been hunted down and systematically eliminated or captured. And we have always been talking about how an encirclement is not necessarily an encirclement, because of the ability for drones to deliver supplies to an area. It is possible to fly a drone over a gray zone area, carrying food, water, ammunition, the things that are required to fight back. However, that has mostly worked because the gray zone in question is usually not that big. In this case, the Russian force trapped in the Kupyansk city center are pretty far away from resupply. Drones can still reach them. That's a long flight. So this is absolutely an encirclement going as encirclements classically do, of these battered forces cut off from the ability to gain new supplies are being destroyed pretty handily. And that gets back to the issue of the lies, because Russia still claims that they hold Kupyansk, even after their force in Kupyansk was practically destroyed. And after most of that city is now back in Ukrainian hands, Russia is still claiming they have it captured. Now, this still goes back to my earlier idea. If they just say that they took it, people are dumb, and especially because the American administration is dumb, they won't check on this, but it's so clearly false. It's so anyone could give Trump an intelligence briefing right now and say this is just wildly untrue, the Russians are lying to you. Zelensky went to a area in Kupyansk that's a bit further away from the fight, though the further away in this point is like 4 kilometers, like not very far, and filmed a short video at the city's entrance saying, here we are at Kupyansk, we had this offensive, everything worked out cool. And this has caused Russian disinformation to go into full-on panic mode, saying this is a fake video, it's AI, this was filmed long ago, which the thing about it being filmed at a different time is the most confusing to me, because if it was filmed at any time in the near past, that point in Kupyansk would have been far more dangerous, whereas they were claiming it was less dangerous. It's hard to wrap your head around the logic of any of these claims, but they are still claiming and finding bizarre, absurd ways to justify their claims that they still hold Kupyansk. In the world of open source intelligence, where positions held are much more fluid than what people give credit for as outside observers, but when you're talking about an entire city, there are ways to check on that. There are ways of Russians posting video of themselves, of Ukrainians posting their own videos of where they are at what time. This is all checkable. There's no way for a city to be entirely under the control of Russians and have no proof of that. But it's still a part of this strange disinformation world where everything they do is lie at all times that really the only thing they can do is stick to that lie, or it's a sign of weakness, even as the lie becomes increasingly absurd. So congratulations to Ukrainian armed forces for effectively retaking Kupyansk. And also, this is some of the most strange disinformation I've seen of the war. And just the last thing I have to say about that is that there is a bit of a sweet spot in lies, where if you tell a little lie, people can believe it because what's the point in lying about it? And if you tell a big lie, then that taps into, the conspiracy brain. Russia discovers Ukrainian biolabs where they were making viruses meant to target Russian people and were turning captured children into super soldiers. That's the kind of thing that it's so bizarre that it just makes it so people want to believe it. So there's the small lies and the big lies. This is like a medium-sized lie. This is like a boring lie. This is a lie of just a position that Russia holds. This is the kind of lie that typically doesn't pass through as well because it lacks both the insignificance of the small lie and the grandiosity and narrative structure of the big lie. It's the kind of lie where you can say, is this true? Can we check to see if it's true? And if the answer is no, then the answer is no. And so it's in this middle spot that I don't even see what's satisfying. It's just not true. It's just fake. Our final battlefield update deals with the city of Vovchansk in the Kharkiv Oblast. This has largely been a stable front for a very long time. The Russians were able to cross over the border in this area and take the northern half of Vovchansk, north of the Vovchka River, and for months and months and months, that has been a stable situation. North side of the river, Russians, south side of the river, Ukraine, with a gray zone in the middle. However, the Russians were able to surge across the Vovchka River and take numerous blocks on the southern part of the city. Now, the Russians have claimed they have taken the entirety of Vovchansk. This is not true. Refer to the last conversation. However, the Ukrainians are holding on to only the southernmost part of Vovchansk, with the majority, really most of the city now under Russian control. The reversal at Kupyansk certainly changes a lot of Russia's plans for the Kharkiv Oblast, but turning a stalemate into a Russian advance is certainly bad news. But the last thing to talk about involving combat has to do with Ukraine's growing strategy of striking at Russia's shadow fleet, these ships that are often unregistered, illegal, smuggling Russian goods, and generally being used to avoid sanctions. And this shadow fleet has been very effective. It turns out that people really do just want to buy things from Russia, and if they can find a way to pretend as though it's legal when they all know it's not, then just take advantage of it. No one's policing them, I suppose. But in addition to some of the added sanctions being passed by both the United States and the European Union, Ukraine has decided to pass its own sanctions, i.e. blowing them up. Most of this campaign has been taking place in the Black Sea. There have been multiple attacks on Russian black market shipping in the Black Sea over these last few weeks, with multiple Russian ships being either destroyed, disabled, or damaged, making the illicit use of Russia's Black Sea ports, for example in Rostov, increasingly dangerous, which will eventually come with increased insurance costs, which add to the Russian economic troubles. But that is also extended outward, and a lot of these attacks, some of them Ukraine has taken credit for, others it denies. There could be cases where Russia even damages its own ships and blames it on Ukraine in order to create a diplomatic incident. Maybe some of that is happening. We do know that Ukraine is doing a lot of it, though. And some of these places where the attacks have happened have been increasingly far afield, including one off the coast of Senegal, and Ukraine is not taking credit for that. But I don't know. It seems like there's a short list of suspects on that one. And also, just very recently, in the Mediterranean Sea off the coast of Libya. So this is definitely a story to keep our eyes on. There may be something more interesting for me to say at a later time. I'll just leave this at, it's very curious how Russia openly operated a naval blockade on Ukraine for many months until that blockade was forced open by Ukrainian missiles and naval drones. Russia continuously attacks Ukrainian ports, blows up ships, including foreign-owned ships, has consistently targeted port infrastructure, including grain elevators, and has continuously been attacking Ukrainian civilian nautical infrastructure. But now that it happens to Russia instead, suddenly there's all these concerns about Russia being a victim of terrorism and Ukraine escalating the war by attacking Russian civilian. Well, keep in mind that the whole point of the Shadow Fleet is to deny that it's Russian shipping to begin with, so you're just gonna blow right past that bit of plausible deniability. And also this idea of it happening outside of the Black Sea as though there's some kind of boundary of where this war can or cannot take place. That the war is fine when it's all the way over there, but the closer it is to over here, the more problematic it becomes. As though there is an area where people are allowed to die in an area where people aren't allowed to die. Once Russian assets get far enough away from Ukraine, they're no longer a target because they're in the civilized, safe part of the world now, not the part of the world where we all just watch horrible things happening and not do anything about it, or worse, cheer it on. So yes, without me doing too much of a deep dive analysis into these attacks themselves, partially because it is so covert, really what we get is the propaganda of it. Here's a cool video of a Ukrainian naval drone blowing up a Russian ship in the Black Sea. Obviously, we can't get too much detail about that anyway, though there are analysts who actually know how naval warfare works who have looked at it. I, as a journalist, am looking more at the media response, and that's my analysis of the media response, is that there is a severe discomfort when not only Ukraine does things back to Russia that Russia already does to it, but also this disturbing quality of having contained areas where life doesn't matter. Anyway, with that, I'll close off the battlefield update part of this and move on to the more diplomacy part. But yeah, it has been quite busy. And in future episodes, I will talk especially more about the Zaporizhzhia axis because that is one that I'm much more familiar with than other parts of the front. Moving on to the American-backed peace plan, which is the phraseology that we decided to go with it. New Voice of Ukraine, the American-backed peace plan. So last we left you off on talking about the various crises that Ukraine was in. Most of the rest of this episode will talking about updates to those crises. But as that episode is coming out was also when more news was coming out about the Witkoff plan. We had talked about this US-backed peace plan being jointly put together by the Russian representative Kirill Dmitriev and the American Steve Witkoff. In the time since that episode, this plan has since been dubbed the Dim-Wit Pact. Dmitriev, Witkoff play on the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of when Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union decided to divide up Eastern Europe between themselves. Here we have Dmitriev and Witkoff deciding to draw up Ukraine between themselves and the dimwits. So again, last we left, it was before Thanksgiving, and this deadline was given for Ukraine to accept these terms was Thanksgiving. That deadline came and went. They have since shifted to demanding that the Ukrainians surrender by Christmas. As we get closer to Christmas, it seems as though that deadline will also come and go because it was all stupid in the first place. This is, before I talk about anything else, this is all a Russian disinformation op. This is a information warfare exercise by the Russians. They have no intention on actually accepting anything. They have injected malicious software into the American system that is already heavily corrupted. It is there to sow chaos, but most importantly, what it's there to do is to get Ukraine to continuously make concessions for nothing in return, to continuously back off of its position. Now, backing off of your position is something that tends to happen during a negotiation process. People tend to not get what they want in all cases. But again, that's during a negotiation. This is not a negotiation. Russia has issued demands, some of them explicit, most of them implicit, so they don't actually have to say anything. Because while Ukraine has continuously put forward a solid list of things that it wants, while the American side puts together a list of points in a possible peace agreement, as horrible as those points may be, and I've been covering that New Voice of Ukraine and videos about that as well. Head over to New Voice of Ukraine patreon.com/NVUA. These are all solid things that Ukraine has backed away from time and time again. Ukraine has accepted the idea of a ceasefire along the line of contact. Ukraine has more or less accepted that there will be losses of territory in whatever peace agreement may come. And this process has forced the Ukrainian side to voice a lot of these concessions more openly. It has gotten, and I'll be talking a little bit later about an article by Valeriy Zaluzhniy where he talks about the various concessions that Ukraine may have to make in order to prepare itself for a future war. But point being, America has continuously been pressuring Ukraine to give up its negotiating position before they enter into a negotiation, which is also known as a terrible way to negotiate. And also, they are imposing what these concessions will be from Ukraine, especially regarding just giving up entirely on the Donbass region. Luhansk and Donetsk, according to the Americans, is and will be a part of Russia, and Ukraine must retreat its forces away from these heavily fortified and, to a large extent, populated still, cities in Donbass, and just giving them away to Russia, these fortified positions that Russia would not have to fight its way through and lose tens of thousands of lives on the way to doing so. Concession after concession after concession made before any negotiation actually happens, while Russia can just sit there and say no. Nothing is being asked of Russia, let alone demanded. Pressure is on them to accept a peace agreement of some kind, but as with both carrots and sticks, more sanctions have been threatened against Russia in case they do not accept a peace plan, but also sanctions have been avoided so they don't have to upset Russia in that process either. What they call good faith gestures, though, are actually very much in bad faith towards Ukraine. But nothing really said of what it is that Russia has to give up. Now, America has pretended that Russia has given up on some positions. America is, for example, pretending that Russia has agreed to freeze the front lines in Kherson and Zaporizhzhia regions where they are, when in fact Russia has explicitly made it clear many, many times that they expect the entirety of those regions, not just where they're currently standing. And the Russians, for their part, know that they can keep their demands very vague, while the Ukrainians have to be very detailed in what they expect and have a list of positions, and being called upon to back away from those positions, Russia can simply say time and time again that we will accomplish the goals of the special military operation. Everything's left foggy. Everything's left vague. They're not saying what they give up, but they're also not really saying what they're demanding. Because when they say what they're demanding, it looks absurd, which is the complete capitulation of Ukraine and the creation of a dismembered rump vassal state controlled by a Russian puppet in Kiev with many regions of Ukraine and next to Russia. They don't say that. They say the goals of the special military operation will be accomplished. Now, they also have been saying many times about how this has to be unconditional. Russia is rejecting the entire idea of a peace process. They have said no to everything. And because they are saying no, America feels the need to offer more and more and more. This isn't a negotiation. This is a petulant child standing there saying no, while the beleaguered parents are saying, how about this? How about this? How about this? Until they eventually just get what they want. They don't know what they want. Children tend not to know what they want. They just want more, and America's fully willing to give them more. This isn't a negotiation. This is an information. It's meant to be destabilizing, and it's meant, even more importantly, to make everyone else in the United States, in Europe, and abroad to be shuffling along, looking to see what will make Russia happy. And Russia can just sit back and watch everyone run around trying to figure out how to appease them. That's what this is. But into some more detail about this, the initial plan put forward by the Americans has since been completely rewritten. We do not know precisely what these proposals are now. They have not been leaked, but we have the general outline of what it's supposed to look like. And this is Ukraine withdraws from the remainder of the Donbass region, hands it over to Russia, but the area that they withdraw from will be demilitarized in a, quote, special economic zone. Really a special economic zone in this case, just means that America wants access to any mineral wealth that exists in it rather than having to go to Russia. This is just pure imperial spoil splitting between the United States and Russia. But it's also absurd, and the Russians, as I said, with everything else, have rejected this idea as well and have openly mocked it. They said, okay, if the military can't be there, then, the police special forces can be there, the National Guard can be there. That's not technically army, therefore why can't it be demilitarized in that way? But generally that was a joke. It was not meant as a serious response to this idea of a demilitarized zone. It was meant to mock the Americans about it. Another point of this would be that there would be no Ukraine in NATO, but there would be some kind of security guarantees that are NATO-esque in quality without actually being NATO. But of course, Russia would not ever approve of such a thing. It's such a bizarre process to watch, as with everything else. The Russians have said they would not accept any proposal with Ukraine in NATO. So the response is to do like a fake NATO. You're not going to rules lawyer the Russians out of that. There's no, well, you didn't say that it couldn't be NATO, the other NATO. No, they're not opposed to NATO as a organization per se. What they're opposed to is the idea that there could be anything preventing them from invading Ukraine in the future. One of those things that could prevent them from invading is NATO, but anything else that prevents them from invading, there's no difference. So of course the Russians would not accept this. And it doesn't even make sense what it's supposed to be, because the Americans have also said that they wouldn't protect NATO. Okay, this is going to be the topic of the next episode, actually. I'm going to go over the new American national security strategy, where there's much more to say about Europe and all that, and NATO and everything. But just to leave that there, the Americans are also basically abandoning NATO. So why would any of this be taken seriously? Which has been the Ukrainian response. You say that there would be NATO-like guarantees. Well, tell us specifically what those guarantees are before we can agree to them. And the Americans not have been forthcoming with that information. There would also be an economic plan in which America would have access to the profits from Ukrainian reconstruction, while there'd also be a separate American-Russian cooperation agreement. Those are the 4 points. The Ukrainian withdrawal from Donbass, security guarantees, whatever that may be, an economic plan for the imperial exploitation of the Ukrainian people and their resources, and also an American-Russian agreement in which they would agree to cooperate on the exploitation of the rest of the world as well. That is what the peace treaty involved is right now. So obviously no one's very keen on it at the moment. But also I wanted to talk a little bit more about these two people, Witkoff and Dmitriev. I talked about them a little bit before, but I'll just expand on that as well. In that, with Witkoff is more present, Dmitriev will talk more about his past. Witkoff, with his present right now, we got more information about his role in the negotiations, and in fact, he was coaching Russia on how to convince Trump to get on their side. So Witkoff was not merely there in a mediation role, let alone as an advocate for Ukraine, which America is supposed to be, but not even as a mediator could he do anything worthwhile, because he was coaching Russia on how to get the Americans to pressure Ukraine for a capitulation. Tell Trump this, talk to him in this specific way, and you'll get Trump to get harder on Ukraine. Witkoff is working for the Russians. We have seen this in many ways. I have been warning about Witkoff in that he is not stupid. He's doing what he's meant to do. And what he is meant to do is to advocate for Russia. He is corrupt, he is mafia, and he is there as another Russian voice in the room. The more he is there, the more damage is done. If Ukraine had the ability, they would reject Witkoff as a mediator in any capacity, because he's not. But the American administration is so fragile that there's no way they would accept this, and would just cause further hostility on the part of Washington towards Ukraine, because America is working alongside Russia. But as for Dmitriev, I didn't talk much about him last time. I think who he is very important, because he has become the point man for Russia dealing with America. He has always been a part of the team, but now he is the head of the team. Even more so than Lavrov, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, or any other diplomat that may be there. So who is Dmitriev? Dmitriev born in Kiev, from Ukraine, Soviet Ukraine, but Ukraine nonetheless. And during the late period of the Soviet Union, as the Soviet Union is opening up, kids are being sent to the United States as part of exchange programs. This is always an important part of better relationships between any two countries, is that they'll open up these student exchange programs. It means that these kids from a very young age are able to gain a more accurate, more wholesome idea about what this other country is like. It builds connections, it builds business, education, friendly, some cases romantic relationships between countries, and that is the stuff that diplomacy is made of. And he was one of these kids. So from the age of 14 to 25, he was studying in America. Originally, he lived with a host family in New Hampshire, before later moving to California with some family friends. As he grew up, he went to Stanford for his undergraduate, then Harvard for his MBA. He went to McKinsey, went to work for the consultancy business McKinsey, which is massive to the point of basically being a cliche, the international management consulting firm. And then from there, works for Goldman Sachs. So this is a very particular type of guy. This is everyone who kind of works in the government. He goes to very good schools, including a Harvard MBA, goes to McKinsey, then goes to Goldman. He has the turnkey kind of resume that the world of American business is made out of. This is a cliche type of guy. Stanford, Harvard, McKinsey, Goldman. You can just rattle that off and people know exactly what you mean by it. So as he becomes the prototypical American businessman, he eventually goes back to Russia in 2000 and spends the 2000s in between Ukraine and Russia. So this is the type of person that America loves in this time period, still does. Well, not anymore, considering the fact that America's closing down a lot of its student exchange programs. But this is the type of person that historically the United States have liked to work with. This is some Dmitriev, businessman, roots in this community, but also has, the American resume that everyone loves, and so gains a lot of clout because of that. So during this time, he also has a lot of pro-Russian sympathies. He says some pretty nasty things about the idea of Ukrainian independence and Ukrainian cultural and political and all the other kinds of independence you can think of. So he's a part of this pro-Russian business elite that also has the bona fides of the American. It's this very interesting character, this very interesting mix of things, where he has a foot in all these different worlds of Russia, Ukraine, and America in ways that are very high level, very connected into what these countries want to work with, which obviously led him to where he is now as this chief negotiator. But also in the 2000s is what he becomes famous for in Ukraine takes place. Now, back in the day when the airport was still open in Kiev, as you're driving in your taxi, leaving Kiev towards Boryspil Airport, one of the last things you see is this obviously not fully constructed apartment complex. This is Olympic Park. At the time, it was the best and most modern and most awesome housing complex that you can build in Kiev. And just how the Kiev real estate market works is that, how people say location, location, location is what real estate's all about. That's not really how it works in Kiev. I personally am in a pretty good location, but for a host of other reasons, it's not the most expensive neighborhood either. It's lovely. I love it here. I love that mix of things. It has what I want. But for people who have the resources available to them, what they want tends to be these mega complexes. Many of them are gated communities. They are often pretty self-enclosed. They have all the stores that you could want already within this territory, often including schools even. I think of one pretty close to me that has an internationally focused English language school as one of its center points. It's not a gated community, but it's a very nice new development. And often to make these work, they have to be in areas that have a lot of land to work with, which means by definition, often it doesn't have to be the best spot per se from a topographical perspective. But point being, Ukrainians love these mega complexes, partially because the buildings are new, and one of the worst things to do in Ukraine is to get an apartment that is terribly old and has pipes built in the 70s on a zero budget. That's what people are afraid of. But these mega complexes, people want to invest in them, and he tried to do his own, this Olympic Park housing development, and just didn't build it. Something like 200 families were scammed out of their money. These families invested in building the apartment unit they wanted, but also had to pay a lot of fees, had to pay for water hookups, all this stuff. Tremendous amounts of money. And just vanished with it. And even now, when I was researching for this, I went to Google Maps, see some pictures of it to make sure that it was the place I was thinking of. And a lot of the pictures on Google Maps even are still of the concept art of what this apartment complex is supposed to look like. The concept art. The computer-generated concept art. And then you look at the actual building, you're like, oh, that's not the same thing at all. There's supposed to be multiple different towers. Only one of them was ever built. There's supposed to be a bunch of stuff on the ground floor, offices, businesses, that kind of thing. Some of that exists. A lot of it does not. And they left the concept art up as if to remind people of how hard they got screwed. So this massive scam. And for that, he being pretty famous in the Ukrainian business community of someone to never work with because he is such a con man, because he's so slimy. And on this very podcast, I have talked many times about the real estate mafia, about how some of the shoddy planning processes that happen in Kyiv, of how people will just build on plots of land that they don't even own sometimes. I'm pretty critical. Of construction in real estate in Kyiv. And even in that dirty world, everyone looked at this guy and said, wow, what a con man. None of us who are already mafia and do dirty stuff all the time, by our own standards, this guy is too much of a thief. This guy is too bad for us. So that's who he is. That's how Ukrainians understand him. But anyway, even after doing this, he shifts more entirely to Russia. He becomes part of the government business liaison in different offices. Most directly, we're talking about the Russian Direct Investment Fund. He is a guy who exists to communicate between the private sector and the government, essentially, to draw investments from other countries, get them directed to where the Russian government wants. That's his role. And because of that, because he is very internationally focused, he becomes a low-level type indirect diplomat. He shows up in the Mueller report about Russian interference. And part of the Russian Gate investigations is that he had a meeting with Erik Prince, the mercenary captain and brother of the former Trump education secretary. And Erik Prince was presenting himself as a representative of the Trump administration, while Dmitriev represented himself as a representative of the Russian government, where they had held a meeting between each other. And that's kind of where we begin seeing him as more of a direct representative of Russia, and more particularly a representative to Trump. Since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, he has been involved in various negotiations, but like I said, as a secondary character rather than a primary one. He was at Riyadh in February. Riyadh being where America and Russia re-began the relationship with each other, until growing in responsibilities until now. And my biggest takeaway with Dmitriev is that he's the most American of the Russians. They know that. And that's why he's being put in charge here. He knows how Americans work. He knows how to communicate to Americans. And that says a lot of bad things about Americans. Because this guy is a giant asshole. He himself is a very Trumpy figure. Now, on the low level, Russian information operations in America have been extremely effective. Russian agents know how to talk to Americans, and more importantly, they know how to hire people who know how to talk to Americans. It's a very large topic that we definitely don't have any time to get into at all. It's one that's been going on for years, covered in many ways, many books. But Russian misinformation, Russian propaganda is very effective in that it knows how to dig into American preoccupations, American anxieties, American conspiracies, in inflating the worst instincts. Which is why it's so weird that Putin and many of his higher officials are so bad at it. We even talked about this last episode. when it comes time for Putin himself to do diplomacy, he fumbles. He has too much of an ego, he is too closed-minded, and he is too hyper-fixated on his own weird conspiracies that talking to another human being is impossible for him, because no one ever actually talks to him. He is the king. He's the czar. Everyone has to just suck up to him. Whatever muscle may have existed that allowed him to talk to people, make deals, has long since atrophied, because he just can't deal with other people on an equal footing. He is constitutionally incapable of that. So when he has appeared, for example, in Alaska, he bored Trump with a lecture on the history of Kievan Rus, the very strange demands that he may have, his weird historical preoccupations and conspiracy theories that made absolutely no sense to someone like Donald Trump, who is himself very closed off to the world, that it just fell apart. It just made Trump mad. Like, why are you talking to me about this Vladislav guy who I've never heard of nor care about? Why won't you shut up about Viking princes? Like, why are you doing this to me? I'm mad now, has been the response that Trump has had to dealing directly with Putin. But then step in Dmitriev. Especially if you follow Dmitriev on Twitter, I don't think he would be able to tell that he is a Russian official. Everything he posts is just the perfect MAGA poster. He trolls people in a very kind of crude and puerile way. He talks about vaccines and vaccine denialism. He knows the script. He's responding to random people just to insult them. No way to tell the difference between him and some random MAGA guy. Now, that should say a lot about MAGA that a Russian government official is identical to them. You think that says something about MAGA, and he has really figured out the exact narratives that Americans want to hear. We have a literal Russian government official talking about how Ukraine is the one driving the war, about how they refuse to sign a peace agreement, about how much money America is wasting on the Ukrainians who just want to keep the war going so they can get paid out more. And he's not really doing it in a Russian way, because there is a Russian version of this that focuses more on how the Russian speakers of Donbass and all that, having to protect them, and the constitutional order of Russia and their rightful historical territory and all that. He doesn't deal as much with that because Americans don't care about that. That's not something that really grips the American propaganda world as much. Why would they care about the historical territorial claims from hundreds of years ago of a country on the other side of the world? That's not what Americans care about. What they care about is essentially, when you boil it down, that they do not want to pay attention to this war anymore and will side with the person who allows them to not care. And that is the narrative that he has dug in on and he has promoted. The Ukrainians are continuing the war. The Ukrainians are rejecting a peace treaty. As his own side is saying that Russia would reject a peace treaty, that Russia will pursue an unconditional surrender, he is saying the American thing, which is that Ukrainians are the ones who are bothering. So yeah, there's something to this. He is put in front of Americans because he is the most American Russian. And what that means, what makes him the most American, is a massive indictment of Americans themselves. Because what makes an American, according to Russia, in a gamble that seems to be working, is being a sociopath and a puerile internet troll. And it works. In our next update to the crises that Ukraine is going through, we're going to be talking about the ongoing corruption scandal that has unseated the head of the former head of the presidential administration, Andriy Yermak. In our last update, went into great detail about what the scandal was, so I'm not going to bother with that now. This is the last episode. But the elevator pitch of it is that essentially some Zelensky allies were caught red-handed doing a corruption scheme where anyone who do business with the major Ukrainian nuclear energy provider would have to kick a percentage of their contracts to them individually. Money was then laundered and delivered to members of this conspiracy. The update to that is that in that episode, I said that Andriy Yermak had not yet been directly named. That's where I left everyone off at, is that Andriy Yermak was assumed to be part of this corruption scheme, but had not yet been directly named. As of, 2 weeks ago at this point, what has happened is that He has been, his residences have been searched, was named as a suspect, and he resigned from office. Andriy Yermak, the Grey Cardinal, Zelensky's right-hand man, is no longer in office. He's gone. This has been the single biggest political shakeup of the Zelensky administration since he was elected into office. Yermak was an extraordinarily powerful and possibly still is extraordinarily powerful political figure. Any government appointment had to be approved by him. He was central to Ukraine's diplomatic efforts with the United States and overall ran the day-to-days of the presidency. He was the vice president, a prime minister, foreign minister, and office administrator to a certain degree, all rolled into one. Now he's gone. That's huge. But who was he? A lot of people have been covering him specifically in his connection to Zelensky, but he is a person. And like Dmitriev, I think I'll do a little update, a little biography of who Andriy Yermak is. And he's a lawyer by trade. He specialized in international intellectual property law. So, like a lot of the other people in the Zelensky orbit, he was in the entertainment industry, but as a lawyer. He later got into producing movies. Not a big one. He said he kind of fell into it because everyone around him was a film producer. But he was the lawyer who helped bring foreign and domestic film studios together. If there was a licensing of foreign film property, he could be involved in it, making sure that a lot of the kind of legal structures that exist in movie localization, movie releases in different countries, that was his deal. And because of his connections with the entertainment industry, it made a lot of sense that he connected with Zelensky back in 2011. So this isn't the deepest of friendships going back to childhood or something, but before Zelensky entered into politics anyway. And they cultivated this friendship since then. And in 2020, becomes Zelensky's chief aide. So after he is made the president, after Zelensky is president of Ukraine, Yermak is eventually promoted from his role as a higher up in the campaign to becoming his head of administration. And he is very effective and most importantly, loyal. So I'm going to channel some of Romeo's take on Yermak on this. So this is not wholly my thoughts. A lot of these are Romeo's thoughts as well, where if you look at the early part of the Zelensky administration, his time in office before the full-scale invasion, a lot of his energies were directed at the de-oligarchization campaign, going after the oligarchs who controlled much of Ukrainian economic and political life. The two biggest targets of de-oligarchization were one, Zelensky's own sponsor, Ihor Kolomoisky, as well as the representative essentially in Russia, the person who Putin most trusted and would have been the president of Ukraine had Russia been able to take Kyiv, Viktor Medvedchuk. These are the two biggest targets because they were super powerful. Though there are others, but these are the two I'd focus on. And this means that Zelensky was making himself very vulnerable from the entrenched power structures that make up Ukrainian politics. Medvedchuk, his connections, his power run deep, as does Kolomoisky's, as does many other people that bumped up against the presidential administration. And during that time, the president's office won time and time again. Oligarchs were losing. But what that means is that Zelensky was very vulnerable. This is someone who was a political outsider who did not have the depth of political connections that his opponent Poroshenko had. And to a large extent, the political connections that he did have before becoming president were through Kolomoisky, and therefore, by targeting Kolomoisky, became extremely unreliable. And through all of this, Yermak had a million opportunities to stab Zelensky in the back, to undermine the de-oligarchization campaign, to expose Zelensky to political attacks, to blackmail, to whatever else. And he didn't. He stayed loyal. And that is what Zelensky valued. Yermak got the job done, and he did it loyally. There are not very many people that he could have said that about, that he could have trusted to fill that role, to be the kind of executor of his political will against the oligarchs, and not have it just lead to Yermak being bought out by Kolomoisky and instead going after Zelensky instead. That matters a lot. So the fact that Zelensky was willing to give up Yermak, or rather that he had to give up Yermak. That means the crisis was deep. According to some inside sources in the presidential administration, Zelensky would not give up Yermak unless it was the absolute last possible thing he could do. If the option was that either Yermak be sacrificed or Zelensky be sacrificed, the choice would be Yermak would be sacrificed, but that's what it had to get back to. And apparently that's what it got down to. This corruption scandal is a very big deal, but any further information about it will come slowly, or at least I thought it would, but this news came very fast. It will be a developing story about how far these investigations go. Thus far, it seems as though Zelensky himself has not been implicated, but likely knew to an extent what was happening. And if he did not know directly, it was because he made a choice not to inform himself on that kind of thing. So whatever more develops out of this corruption scandal will be interesting, to say the least. But at the same time, as I predicted in the last episode, the fact that now America has all but made itself an open enemy of Ukraine has caused a rally around the flag effect. So while Zelensky's popularity is declining, certainly, you can't really say that it necessarily must lead to political changes because of that. Though, what we have since seen in the parliament, in the last episode, I said that there were being a push to create a national unity government between the ruling Servant of the People party and the several opposition parties. The political party of the former president, Petro Poroshenko, has really dug in and has been refusing to do votes on things such as budgets until such a government can be reformed. If you look at the Ukrainian commentariat, there are more and more demands for a more neutral government, a government that is not just Zelensky and the servant of the people. This will be harder to do because, as I've already described, servant of the people does have an absolute majority in the parliament. So technically they can do whatever they want if they really want to. So it all comes down to popular demand for what to do on that. There are calls for a non-partisan prime minister, so not somebody from servant of the people, but a kind of neutral, maybe technocratic type figure that can mediate the political processes while not just taking orders from the president's office, which has until now been a major complaint about the Ukrainian parliament, is that it largely just does what Zelensky tells them to do because it's just his party that's in charge. So from a Ukrainian perspective, this is a big deal that there be some legislative independence from the executive. But as an American and looking at America, the idea of the president's political party doing something to disagree with him or doing something outside of control would be shocking to happen in the US. But that's what's being demanded of them in Ukraine. Some of the other political demands that are coming in is because Yermak had such tight control over the diplomatic processes of Ukraine, the foreign ministry has largely been sidelined. They certainly fill practical roles. They do the things that a foreign ministry has to do. But when it comes down to political decisions, strategy, actually carrying out diplomacy itself, the foreign ministry has largely been sidelined in favor of the presidential administration. So one of the demands being made right now is that power of the presidential administration devolve back to where it's supposed to be. Let the foreign ministry handle more things involving diplomacy. Let the defense ministry handle more things having to deal with the military, etc., etc. Let it devolve more to professionals, the administrative bureaucracy, rather than purely the presidential administration. So that is kind of where the political winds are blowing at the moment, though we have not seen a direct outcome of those demands quite yet. Meanwhile, some of the conflicts between NABU, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, who investigates corruption, and the SBU, there has been a lot of tension between NABU and SBU acting largely on behalf of the president, and NABU investigating corruption. You understand where that can become an issue when it comes down to political struggles, but the SBU has begun to bend more against NABU. They had been a series of very questionable investigations of NABU investigators by the SBU, with them being arrested, had their properties searched, generally being harassed by the Ukrainian equivalent of the FBI, and that drawing a lot of the conflict outward. It was very public what this conflict was in a way that made the SBU and by extension the president's office look bad. And the SBU has bent on that. They have ended some of these investigations, and 2 NABU investigators who had been arrested by the SBU have been released. So that kind of rounds off the state of the Energo-Atom case right now. But building on that previous story, I'm now going to bring up an article that the former commander of the Ukrainian military and presently the ambassador to the United Kingdom, Valeriy Zaluzhniy, put out. He put an op-ed in Liga.net, a Ukrainian publication, that on the surface was a description of the current state of the war. He occasionally writes these op-eds, and let's put it this way, Valeriy Zaluzhniy, if there was an election right now, I think he'd win. He is very well trusted, especially amongst the military. He has a very strong reputation for not being corrupt, for his successes in the early part of the war. He is a very highly trusted figure. And when he writes these op-eds, you pay attention to them because they say something about where Ukraine is going. So I just want to bring up this op-ed that he wrote recently. And on the surface of it, it largely has to do with strategy, what Ukraine has to do. I'm going to link it in the description. I highly encourage you to read it. It begins with a lot of discussions about military strategy and like 19th century theorists like Clausewitz, the nature of war, that kind of thing. It's an interesting discussion, but there are 2 things I'm going to pull out of it. The rest, still read it. I'm not talking about the entire article. There's a lot in here. It covers a lot of points. I don't want to go over all those points. I'm going to instead focus solely on 2 things that make themselves more apparent on a closer reading that you may not notice reading it yourselves. I have this complaint about a lot of reaction content talking about YouTube videos or something, is that by you not reading or watching the original piece of information, you are left only with a person's interpretation of it, which is always going to be a distortion of what the person originally said. This is just a pet peeve I have of current media. So please do me a favor and read the original article and giving me the freedom to comment on it without feeling guilty about misrepresentation. So here are the 2 things that I pulled out of it. 1, if you scroll down a bit to about the middle point, he gets into a description of the state of readiness of the Russian and Ukrainian militaries before the war. So I'll quote, Russia increased its military budget year after year, invested resources in the defense industrial complex, and purchased more and more weapons and equipment. They significantly outnumbered us both in numbers and equipment. Starting in 2019 and for the next 3 years, Russia's military spending only increased. At that same time, in Ukraine, everything happened the other way around. In 2021, the army was allocated even less money than in the previous year. And although politicians loudly declared that more than 5% of GDP was allocated to the security and defense sector, this is not only about the armed forces, it is also about the National Police, the Security Service of Ukraine, the National Guard, and Border Guards. Of the 260 billion hryvnia, less than half was for the Ministry of Defense. Funding for the development and procurement of weapons and equipment was not increased. The bulk of the money traditionally went to providing financial support for the military. Because of this, the armed forces of Ukraine were in a state of stagnation. There was a lack of finances for development and increasing combat readiness. There was a problem of personnel outflow and understaffing of military units. The budget of 2022 was adopted by Parliament, and in the conditions of an escalation of the situation and the buildup of Russian troops near the Ukrainian borders. As a result, grew by only 10% and reached 133 billion hryvnia. But this is nothing compared to the challenges that awaited Ukraine and the armed forces of Ukraine in connection to Russia's full-scale aggression. The future will show that the persistent underfunding of the army has led to the accumulation of a whole series of problems. And it goes on about specific numbers and that kind of thing. But this voiced a complaint that has been kind of sidelined in the Ukrainian political sphere, which is that Ukraine was not ready for the Russian invasion, that choices were made that made Ukraine even less ready for the Russian invasion. Zelensky was brought on as a peace candidate and did not really do much for the military. In fact, came into conflict with the army on several occasions regarding unilateral moves to inspire Russia to deal in peace, which all failed. Now, from my perspective, I think that properly communicated, these actions taken by Zelensky in this time to very much be a peace president had value. I think that Ukraine did everything in its possibilities to show that it was trying to reach peace in Donbass. He even, in his declared strategy about Crimea, said that an invasion was not what Ukraine had in mind. He would just put focus on Crimean culture and that kind of thing to keep the problem in people's minds, but he wasn't exactly going to launch an armored assault into the peninsula, and was clear about that. In a sane world, this should have worked more in Ukraine's favor, but it didn't. Ukraine continuously showed, and especially Ukraine under Zelensky, continuously showed that it would be the more accommodating party, offer more and more to Russia, only for it to be slapped away. And it took a bit of time for Zelensky to learn that that was not working and was often counterproductive. But that's politics. That is a very valid stance to take, and I don't think that it is a fair thing to attack him on. But we certainly know in hindsight, and you could tell at the time, was that Ukraine needed to continuously build up its military preparedness for Russia. The invasion was eventually coming, as we know because it came. The reality that we live in is that the invasion was coming. During that time period, Ukraine made a lot of improvements to its military, a lot of modernizations, which led to be able to put up a fight in 2022 that it could not put up in 2014. The difference between the Ukrainian military of 2014 and 2022 and now 2025 going into 2026 is night and day difference. So much better trained, so much better everything. But that was not where Zelensky's priorities were when they really should have been. More frighteningly, as it gets into here, as of the end of 2021, the Russian army was 5 times larger than the Ukrainian one, with 4 times more tanks and armored combat vehicles, 3.4 times more artillery, and 4.5 times more attack helicopters. The situation in the Ukrainian Navy was even sadder. We had no aircraft carriers. As of August 2021, the armed forces of Ukraine numbered 250,000, of which 204,000 were military personnel. The size of the Russian army increased from year to year, by the time already amounted to over 1 million military personnel. In 2021, Russia was preparing for the full-scale invasion, and they did it very openly. Ukraine had nearly a year, or at least 6 months, or at least 3 months at the very end, to prepare more for the invasion, and did not. Ukraine should have built more defenses. Ukraine should have mobilized, but did not. The calculation was that it would cause a disruption to the economy, that people would be scared. And if the Russian invasion never came, it would have been a giant waste of resources, and it would have made Ukraine look like a bunch of crazy people shouting about a wolf in the woods. But what did happen is that the Russians invaded, and that the Ukrainian military was underprepared when it did. Not entirely unprepared. There was a military buildup in the last moments before the Russian invasion. The Donbass, in particular, was fortified, was sent more soldiers because the assumption would be that the main Russian effort would be in Donbass. It just wasn't. It was at Kiev. This was a failure. Zelensky, thus far, at least overtly, has not been gone after too hard for this. There's a war. We can litigate the war after the war is over. But these complaints have been in the background. People know. And Zaluzhniy bringing this up at a time of political weakness of Zelensky was not an accident. This is an accusation on his part. It was a political maneuver to blame the presidential administration for things that it is rightfully blamed for. There are a lot of other things to investigate. We have to go over what the SB was doing. We have to go over why Kherson fell so quickly. We have to go over why the Russians were able to so easily access sensitive records of the military personnel. We have to go over why the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate was so prepared to collaborate with the Russian invaders. We have to go over the many other collaborators that existed in Ukraine's midst for such a long time, and though they could be accused of certain things, were essentially allowed to carry out their activities. There's a lot to question about what was happening in the year 2021, but this is part of it. This is not everything can be blamed on the presidential administration. At the end of the day, I do think that Zelensky has done a good job as president. But this here, about the unpreparedness for the war, is even more than a corruption scandal, a major liability if there ever can be a proper investigation and if blame gets shifted into that direction. And the other point that's raised in this article, how I just talked, is so much more than Zaluzhniy ever said. I'm kind of putting words in his mouth right now, but a figure such as Zaluzhniy, who is kind of looked at as an opposition figure, even though he has never said he has gotten into politics, this point about 2021 and not being prepared at that time, like I said, at a point where Zelensky is vulnerable, that is done deliberately. Moving on. Later on in the article, he goes over that a peace agreement, kind of connecting our two major stories of this episode, that a peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia would be beneficial for Ukraine, that if there could be a cease of hostilities at the line of contact without formally recognizing Russian annexations, it would allow Ukraine to have time to build up its military forces, to be more ready for the next war, which is an inevitability. And some commenters just kind of left it at that. Zaluzhniy saying that Ukraine needs to sign this peace agreement. Those people didn't read the whole article because just a little bit down the line, he says this. I'll just quote this section. The very concept of ending this agreement, he goes on to basically trash the idea of it. First of all, going back to quotes, first of all, there are no prerequisites for this. Perhaps the main one is the ongoing active high-intensity hostilities and attacks on the economy from both sides. This is why shifting the emphasis from ceasefire negotiations to concluding a final peace agreement makes it impossible for them to even be accepted in Ukraine due to the unacceptable conditions for us, because we have already paid too high of a price. Secondly, in conditions where the concept of international law, and especially the system to support this law, no longer exists, concluding such agreements without creating guarantees of long-term security is absolutely impossible. Such security guarantees could include Ukraine's accession to NATO, the deployment of nuclear weapons on Ukrainian territory, or the deployment of a large military contingent capable of confronting Russia. However, there is no talk about this today. And taking into account the technological and doctrinal unpreparedness of any NATO member country, or any country except Russia, Ukraine, and China, this issue cannot be considered in principle, and therefore the war will probably continue. However, we should not forget that not only in the military, but also in the political and economic spheres. Another aspect is the gradual reduction in the cost of war due to technological development, on the one hand, and the increase in total strike capabilities on the other. This could lead to a situation where Russia will eventually need the same security guarantees, as strange as it may sound. Then, presumably, the basis of security guarantees should be capitals that can be mutually guarantee their preservation, which in turn will prevent collapse in the post-war years in both Ukraine and Russia. Because, of course, such economic losses will also have political consequences. This was already at the beginning of the 20th century. Therefore, formulating the political purpose of the war is the most difficult test for the thinking of a politician. Here, the most erroneous ideas are possible. War is to a large extent a catalogue of blunders, said Winston Churchill. However, perhaps the main political goal for Ukraine is to deprive Russia of the opportunity to carry out acts of aggression against Ukraine in the foreseeable future. At the same time, it should take into account that Russia can implement such intentions by choosing one of two strategies. In any case, such an act of aggression will be carried out on both the military and political and economic fronts. The tools and forms of an aggression change, but they all serve the same political goal. What he is arguing is that it would be nice if there could be a peace agreement that included reliable security guarantees for Ukraine. But those security guarantees aren't coming. Ukraine cannot trust Russia not to attack in the future, and has to be very, very cautious about the promises of security guarantees from anyone else, because time has shown those promises mean very little without actual skin in the game. Ukraine must be so ready for war that Russia itself would need a mutual security guarantee from Ukraine, that Russia would not be able to attack Ukraine because they would be so afraid of Ukrainian response. And I agree with that. I certainly agree with that analysis. The only thing that would stop a future war, and therefore the only thing that can secure a present peace, is Russia actually being afraid of Ukraine and the military buildup, military support that would go into that. So yeah, that was my other takeaway from this article, is that was being presented essentially as a call for Ukraine to go to negotiations when really it was kind of an argument against that in a way, or at least against it as it's currently being formulated. And the last topic we'll talk about has to do with Europe providing funding from Ukraine and providing funding that from Ukraine from frozen Russian assets in the European Union. This has been an ongoing discussion within the EU for a very long time. As it stands right now, how it works is that Russian assets, especially Russian bank accounts in the European Union, are frozen, but it's still there. Those Russian assets exist largely in the form of bonds. Those bonds mature and they generate profits. They are investments. At the moment, the profits from those investments are used to fund Ukraine. So the European Union has not seized the assets themselves, but the profits from those assets are sent to Ukraine rather than to Russia or left in the account. And the effort has been to actually take those Russian assets as they actually exist, not just the dividends. But that has been very legally difficult. So I'll give you the argument again. So the argument for, obviously, is that these are Russian assets. Russia can kick rocks. We can take their stuff. Russia has confiscated the assets of Western companies on its own territory, including outright confiscating a lot of passenger planes. When we talk about Russian actions in the occupied territories, the idea of saying you can't confiscate Russian property as they just steal people's homes and kill and torture and do all the nasty things that we talk about on this podcast that Russia does. The idea of saying that Russian property is more sacrosanct than any of that is absurd to the point of insulting. But here are the arguments against seizing Russian assets. One, there is no real legal precedent of how to do that. Wars very often end in reparations, or basically agreements from the losing side to pay the cost of the war by the winning side. War indemnities, that kind of thing. So if Russia agrees in a peace agreement to pay war indemnities, then those assets can be seized and be treated as part of those indemnities. But until that point, there is very little in the way of legal precedent to actually seize the assets themselves, because Russia did not agree to give them up. And two, the argument that especially European banks have been making is that if the precedent does exist, that governments can confiscate foreign holdings in their domestic banks, then that means they can do that to anyone else. And therefore, banking in Europe would be much less reliable and therefore more expensive and less attractive and less profitable. That, I say, maybe that this practice of doing international business between countries, maybe some of those countries shouldn't be done business with. If a genocide puts you at financial risk, maybe you'll think twice about doing a genocide. I don't know. Maybe doing business with Russia for so long did not, as the liberal international relations theorists might say, prevent war. The theory is that the interconnectedness of all these economies of different countries mean that war becomes more costly than peace, and therefore economically minded countries will prefer peace to war. That I will not go to war with you because I'd rather be doing business with you. That clearly didn't work. Russia did business with Europe and the rest of the world as a normal trading partner, as a completely normal economy from the moment of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and even before that, up until the full-scale invasion when the sanctions came into play. Even then, the sanctions are not very strong. That didn't stop anything. So the entire theoretical basis of this neoliberal peace theory of business equals peace, it holds no ground. And I wrote a newsletter about this before. I'll probably expand on that in the new year about the various IR theories that I'm kind of touching on right now. But so maybe the question should not be what other bad guys will want to do business with us if we seize the property of bad guys. It should be, why are we promoting the wealth and influence of those bad guys in the first place? Maybe a country doing what Russia did should carry consequences. So maybe if we want a world that had more peace, we should use global economic interconnectedness to assert that rather than the other way around, where we say we can't do anything against violators of international peace because it would disrupt our economics. It's completely backwards. Maybe we should want a world that doesn't suck. I don't know. That's getting more into the video series, which I'm working on. Don't worry, guys. It's not dead. I did not just put out one episode, then kill the idea. I promise you more episodes of the multi-crisis will be coming out. The next episode about the building of the international liberal world order is coming, but I have a lot of things to talk about in December and limited resources to deal with, so it's going to be pushed to January. The next episode is going to be a response to the new American national security, and then the other will cover some new stories that were kind of pushed back because they were not so timely. But then the new year, and then a Q&A, then multi-crisis. Anyway, back on topic. So those are the logical arguments against, but now there's some more conspiratorial arguments about what's going on here, and that the European banking industry is heavily connected to Russia. Europe made a lot of money doing banking and other financial services for Russia and Russian oligarchs. Some of that completely legitimate, at least according by the standards of the international economy. Some of that illegitimate in the form of money laundering. Therefore, European financial industry, as well as a lot of just industry in general, have decades of interconnection with Russia and therefore personal connections with Russia. Many of them would like to go back to normal. They want this war to just disappear. Maybe they want Ukraine to just surrender and be done with. It doesn't matter how many have to die. Just allow the economic tap to turn back on so we can all make money. And among them, they may be trying to hinder anything that could damage their relations with their future cash cows. This happens on a very personal level. But we also look at some very direct shadiness, not just the business projections, but actual threats. A French banker linked with Euroclear allegedly threatened its CEO, like physically threatened. This person who did the threatening, Hubi, silly name, but Olivier Hubi is deeply connected to Russia, has gone back and forth tons of times. He's a member of Russian societies, including the Russian Geographical Society. He is simply a Russian asset that exists within the European banking system, tied to Euroclear, this Belgian bank, which is what most of this is about. These Russian assets, most of them that are under discussion, are invested in Euroclear, this Belgian bank. And Hubi has consistently sent violent threats to Valérie Urban, like threatening to burn her house down, basically. And she did not receive any particular protections. You'd think that the CEO of this mega bank, someone threatening her, would receive more of a response, and it just did not. So there is this conspiratorial aspect to it as well that I have to dip down on. And that is the context that this all exists in. But Europe was investigating the possibility of seizing these assets anyway, and was making progress on it until the Prime Minister of Belgium, in the country where these assets are being held, said that it would not seize Russian assets because Belgium was warned by Russia that Russia would consider this an attack on Russia and would do a response. So there's the threat. Now, a lot of people have really targeted the Prime Minister of Belgium for this, and Belgium as a country for making this decision not to seize Russian assets. They have really become the center point of this controversy. However, I would not go quite that far. Now, it does not help things that the Prime Minister of Belgium, Bart de Wever, has been a total asshole about this whole situation. He is not just saying no, but he has always thrown in these little insults. And for example, when there was a recent vote, spoiler to the end of this story, Europe eventually votes not to seize Russian assets. But the Belgian explanation for this was that, the good Western Europeans looked at this from a proper and neutral perspective and acted responsibly, not to violate the law, and acted responsibly in a way that best serves European interests, while those Eastern Europeans who voted to seize Russian assets were just acting emotionally. Because that's what those Eastern Europeans are. A bunch of emotional louts who are always, I don't know, I'm doing like a pseudo-Britishism. He's Belgian. I don't know how a posh Belgian person, I don't know Belgian stereotypes enough to follow through on this. So I'll just continue in this register that these Eastern Europeans are a bunch of louts who just act out of emotion and just want to hit thing with stick that they don't like. And this has been an ongoing problem in Europe, where the Poles, the Lithuanians, the Estonians, the Latvians, the Ukrainians have been warning about Russia for so long, and were told that they were just being emotional, and this is just a bunch of nationalists who carry on their ancient hatreds that are totally backwards and uncalled for in this modern world. But they turned out to be right. Russia really was a threat. And all the good Western Europeans who said that those days were over were wrong. But no one really learned. But anyway, him being a deeply unpleasant person allowed him to become much more of a lightning rod in this debate than really he deserved. We've been kind of unfair to him, even though he invited the unfairness. Because really, a lot of Europe did not want to seize Russian assets because of the counter arguments that I already gave. Italy didn't. It turned out France didn't. And they just kind of allowed Belgium to take the heat for what they themselves were unwilling to do. And in fact, a lot of the Belgian stance here was that they would seize Russian assets if the rest of Europe would also assume the liability for it. This is all from a legal perspective based on the idea that eventually Russia will sign an agreement where they agree to pay war reparations that would formalize the seizure of their property. But the worry was that if they never signed this agreement to pay Ukraine war reparations, then the Europeans would have seized their assets without their consent, and Russia would have to be paid back. What Belgium was saying was that if Russia came calling to collect on its lost assets, the entirety of Europe would legally be on the hook to pay them back, not just Belgium. Because as it stood, Belgium would bear sole responsibility, and Russia would demand that Belgium pay back the entirety of what they took. From my perspective, this is stupid. Just don't give it back. Russia takes everyone else's stuff. You can take their stuff. If Russia comes calling and says, you owe us, just say no. No, we don't. Go screw yourself. But I understand from a legalistic and banking perspective, they can't say that outright. And so this put Belgium in a very sticky situation, and no other European country was signing on to share this liability. Now, in the end, the European Union made some decisions that ultimately do benefit Ukraine. One, the EU made a decision that these Russian assets would be frozen indefinitely. This was mainly done because Hungary was saying that it would use its veto in the EU system in order to release Russian funds, because Hungary is working for Russia. They're an enemy country at this point. But Hungary was saying that we don't want to risk Russian anger, and therefore we, Hungary, use our vote in the European Union in order to unfreeze Russian assets, and all these billions of dollars can flow back into Russia that had been held in Europe. The European Union said, no, that sounds like a terrible idea. We're going to make our procedure that no, you cannot vote to do that. We are voting that this can be done indefinitely. If you, Hungary, are not on board with this, we can say, sure, you, Hungary, cannot stop us from doing that. So that's one very important decision that was made. The other is that the EU did pass 2 years worth of funding for Ukraine. That funding is there. It was very concerning that there had not been very many backup plans in order to secure Ukraine funding in the EU without Russian funds. The gamble was that this attempt to confiscate Russian assets would be the primary source of funding for Ukraine, and therefore, when it looked like that confiscation was not happening, it put the entire strategy of funding Ukraine into question. Ultimately, Europe decided to pass that funding anyway. This was done in the form of loans, but it said that the only reason those loans would have to be repaid is through Russian war indemnities, war reparations. So it's still counting on the idea of there being war reparations, but this is much more straightforward and non-messy. If Ukraine does not get those war reparations from Russia, they're not paying those loans. But what this does is it puts more of a financial strain on Europe. And quite frankly, what we have seen from Europe, from America, is that they're very tired of paying for Ukraine. In America, the end of that funding already came. Europeans are continuing it, and there's still support for continuing it in most European countries. That's not really the danger, but it is still a debt. It's still another chipping away at how much the EU is able to tolerate. If this builds up more and more, it will lead to economic and social conditions that will make Europeans less supportive of support for Ukraine. Very short-sighted, yes. Very stupid, yes. This is a priority. If Russia takes Ukraine, if Russia wins, if Russia is able to expand its war outwards into Moldova and elsewhere, Europe's safety and comfort is over. And there's going to be a lot more problems than just these loans to Ukraine. But from a populist perspective, they can blame these loans and a lot of their domestic problems, because that's what populists do. They find a foreigner that they can blame for their own problems. And these loans will be treated as a scapegoat for whatever they need to be used as a scapegoat for, because it's European money. This could have been Russian money. The Europeans would not have to go in debt for this. They could have used Russian money instead of their own to do this, but they did not, which is seen as a kind of loss. So that money is there, Ukraine is getting funded, but in a way that's very suboptimal. It has gotten a much more negative reception in Ukraine than it has to. The money's still coming. That's fine, but it should have been Russian money. It also would have sent a signal that Russia's not normal, and that's another thing the Ukrainians want. With that, I'm going to end this episode. The next episode will be an analysis of the new American strategy, national security strategy, and how it's basically America saying that it's willing to split up the world into spheres of influence with Russia and China. It's a very dark document, which Russia has thrown into Europe's face. But until then, so happy Christmas when that episode comes out. Leaving that off now, if you'd like to support Ukraine, you can look at the link tree in our description, which has a series of information resources as well as charities. If you would like to support Ukraine Without Hype on a financial level, you can go to patreon.com/Ukraine Without Hype and join our list of supporters. Patreon.com/Ukraine Without Hype is also how you support our sister podcast, Radio Free America, which takes the editor's pen to mainstream news sites such as the New York Times and how they have been failing to bring you proper news. So thank you very much to all of our supporters. Thank you to Randy McNerlin. The voices in my head are from Big Pharma, Kyle Smith, Damascus Medusa, Giorgio, David Shepard, Ivanika Gratskaya, Michael Drucker, PLM, Arminius, T. Bart, Barbara Station, Devi, Anonymous, Michael Wickman, Daniel Louise, Marguerite, Kevin Alberton, Silas Frank, Dimitri Litvin, Dennis Napalm, Vivek, James Burke, Megan, Elizabeth Hughes, Nick Niazin, Andy S., John Gates, Sanjay, Grace Krause, Laura De Leon, Had to Laugh, Jacob Boehm, Justin Devendorf, Chris Bennington, Lovey Grove, James Wise, Alex Strochmal, Anna McDonald, Jared, Victor Matei, Scott Tokayuk, Etienne Soleil, Anastasia, Captain Technical, Evelyn, Veronica, Matt Miller, Julia Lindsay, Emily Bavona, Scott Burry, Anonymous, Subtle Knight, Sandra Bongers, Marianne, Abs, RDK, Francois, Laurie Halila, Justin R., Christopher Yee, Lemonican, Demetrio, Ursula Zolenkoff, Noah Brown, Glowing Wind, Can Dystopian Fiction Please Remain Fiction, Row. Thank you all very much for your support. You're what make this all possible. Until next time, Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, and Slava Ukraini.